Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone in her congressional office at 2:47 a.m., staring at the voting card that would either destroy her political future or betray everything she believed in. In 12 hours, she would cast the most controversial vote of her career, and not a single progressive ally would stand beside her. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to choose between your principles and your relationships? Are you watching from your phone while thinking about times you've stood alone for what you believed was right? We want to know where our viewers are tuning in from around the country as we dive into this incredible story of political courage and the devastating personal cost of following your conscience in Washington. It was October 14th when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez received the call that would change everything. She was in her Bronx apartment enjoying a rare, quiet evening with her partner Riley when her chief of staff Chakrabarty's name flashed across her phone screen. The urgency in his voice immediately told her that this wasn't a routine political update. AOC, we have a problem, he said without preamble. Leadership is fast-tracking the Iron Dome funding bill for a floor vote tomorrow. They want unanimous Democratic support, and they're expecting you to be on board without question. The Iron Dome funding had been a contentious issue within progressive circles for months. The defensive missile system, designed to protect Israeli civilians from rocket attacks, represented exactly the kind of military aid that many in AOC's base viewed as complicit in ongoing Middle Eastern conflicts. Yet it was also framed as purely defensive technology, saving civilian lives regardless of broader political disputes. AOC felt her stomach tighten as she absorbed the implications. This wasn't just any vote. This was the kind of issue that could define her entire political career and determine whether she remained the progressive movement's brightest star or became its most disappointing sellout. She had built her reputation on unwavering principle, on being the congresswoman who couldn't be bought, pressured, or convinced to compromise her values for political expediency. Her supporters had donated millions of dollars and volunteered countless hours because they believed she was different from other politicians, that she would never cave to establishment pressure or abandon the causes that had brought her to Washington. But the political reality was far more complex than the black and white world of campaign rhetoric. The Iron Dome system was designed to intercept incoming rockets and missiles, preventing civilian casualties without offensive capabilities. Military experts argued that opposing such defensive technology was tantamount to supporting civilian deaths, while progressive activists saw any military aid as enabling broader policies they fundamentally opposed. That night, AOC barely slept. She paced her apartment, reading briefing materials, consulting with policy advisors, and trying to find a path that would allow her to maintain both her principles and her political relationships. The more she researched, the more impossible the decision became. By 6 a.m., her phone was buzzing with messages from progressive organizations, squad members, and constituency groups, all assuming she would vote against the funding. Justice Democrats, the organization that had helped launch her career, sent a statement praising her expected opposition to militaristic policies that perpetuate violence. The Democratic Socialists of America released a memo calling the vote a test of progressive authenticity, but other voices were equally compelling. Holocaust survivors in her district had reached out through intermediaries, explaining how defensive systems like Iron Dome represented the difference between life and death for innocent families. Military briefings detailed how the technology had prevented thousands of civilian casualties, saving lives without contributing to offensive operations. AOC arrived at her congressional office at 7:30 a.m., hoping to find clarity in the familiar surroundings where she had made so many difficult decisions. Instead, she found a series of meetings that would make her choice even more agonizing. Her first visitor was Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, one of her closest allies and fellow squad member. Tlaib's Palestinian heritage and family connections made her opposition to the funding deeply personal, and she assumed AOC would stand with her without question. "Alex, this is it," Tlaib said, using the familiar nickname that indicated their close friendship. "This is the moment we show whether we're actually going to challenge the military-industrial complex, or if we're just going to be like every other politician who talks big during campaigns and caves when it matters." The conversation was painful for both women. AOC respected Tlaib's perspective and understood the personal pain that informed her position, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for making decisions based on more than ideological purity. The friendship that had sustained them through countless political battles was suddenly strained by an issue that seemed to have no middle ground. Her next meeting was with Congressman Gerald Nadler, a senior Democrat whose district included many Jewish Americans deeply concerned about Israel's security. Nadler's approach was more measured, but his message was equally clear. Opposing defensive technology would be seen as abandoning allies and innocent civilians. "Alexandria, I respect your principles," Nadler said during their brief conversation. "But sometimes leadership means making difficult choices that don't fit neatly into campaign slogans. The Iron Dome saves lives, period. Everything else is political theater." The meetings continued throughout the morning, each one adding another layer to an already impossible decision. Progressive organizations sent representatives to remind her of campaign promises. Jewish community leaders shared personal stories of family members whose lives had been saved by missile defense systems. Palestinian American constituents expressed their pain at seeing defensive aid as complicity in broader policies they opposed. By noon, AOC realized that no matter what she decided, she would disappoint people she cared about and respected. This wasn't a typical political calculation where she could find a compromise position or delay the decision until she found more favorable political terrain. The vote was happening, and she had to choose. She called a meeting with her senior staff to work through the implications of each option. The discussion was frank and sometimes heated, as advisors who had worked together harmoniously for years suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an issue that seemed to have no good answers. Her communications director, Lauren Hitt, laid out the political realities with characteristic bluntness. "If you vote yes, every progressive organization that supported you will feel betrayed. If you vote no, you'll be attacked as being against protecting civilian lives. Either way, you're going to lose supporters and face criticism." Her policy director, Dan Riffle, focused on the substantive arguments. "The question isn't whether you'll face criticism, it's whether you can live with your decision and explain it to yourself and your constituents. What does your conscience tell you is right?" As the afternoon wore on, AOC found herself increasingly isolated, not by choice, but by circumstance. The issue had created divisions even within her own team, with staffers who normally worked together seamlessly suddenly unable to agree on the most fundamental questions. She tried calling other squad members to discuss the vote, but found that the conversations only reinforced how alone she was in her uncertainty. Tlaib remained convinced that opposing the funding was the only principled position. Ilhan Omar expressed similar views, though with more acknowledgement of the complexity involved. Ayanna Pressley was more supportive of AOC's struggle, but offered no clear guidance on how to resolve it. The progressive organizations that had championed AOC's rise began applying pressure with increasing intensity as the day progressed. Social media campaigns targeting her vote were launched, with hashtags demanding she vote her values and stand with justice. Former supporters who had donated to her campaign sent messages expressing their disappointment at her apparent hesitation. But equally compelling voices were reaching out from the other direction. Moderate Democrats made it clear that opposing defensive technology would be seen as evidence that progressives couldn't be trusted with national security issues. Party leadership sent subtle but unmistakable signals that a no vote would have consequences for her committee assignments and future legislative priorities. By evening, AOC was experiencing the loneliness that comes with leadership at its most difficult moments. She had always prided herself on building coalitions and finding common ground, but this issue seemed designed to make coalition building impossible. Every potential ally was asking her to choose sides in a conflict where choosing sides meant abandoning other allies. She spent the evening in her office reading constituent emails that reflected the same impossible divisions she was feeling internally. Teachers who had supported her campaign wrote passionate messages about standing up to militarism. Jewish families who had voted for her sent equally passionate appeals about protecting innocent lives. Palestinian American supporters shared stories of family members affected by broader Middle Eastern policies. At 11 p.m., AOC called her mother in the Bronx, hoping for the kind of clarity that sometimes comes from talking to someone outside the political bubble. The conversation was brief but meaningful, as Blanca Ocasio-Cortez reminded her daughter that political careers were temporary but personal integrity was permanent. "Mia, "I didn't raise you to make decisions based on what other people want," her mother said simply. "I raised you to do what you think is right, even when it's hard." The advice was both comforting and terrifying, because AOC had already begun to realize what her conscience was telling her, even if she didn't want to acknowledge it. The Iron Dome system, whatever its broader political implications, was designed to save civilian lives. Opposing technology that prevented innocent deaths felt impossible to justify, regardless of the political consequences. But accepting this conclusion meant accepting that she would disappoint and anger people who had believed in her, who had supported her when she was an unknown bartender challenging one of the most powerful Democrats in Congress. It meant acknowledging that political leadership sometimes required making decisions that couldn't be easily explained in campaign materials or social media posts. The night was long and largely sleepless as AOC wrestled with the gap between political ideals and governing realities. She had entered politics believing that principled positions were always possible, that there were clear lines between right and wrong, and that courage was simply a matter of standing up to powerful interests. This vote was teaching her that real political courage sometimes meant disappointing your own supporters, making decisions that couldn't be reduced to simple talking points, and accepting responsibility for choices that would be misunderstood by people whose opinions mattered to you. By 2:47 a.m., she was sitting alone in her office, holding the voting card that would determine not just her position on one piece of legislation, but her relationship with the progressive movement that had made her a national figure. The vote was still hours away, but she knew what she had to do. The decision brought no peace, only the grim satisfaction of knowing she was following her conscience rather than her political interests. She would vote to fund the Iron Dome system because she believed saving civilian lives was more important than maintaining ideological purity. But she also knew that this decision would cost her relationships, support, and possibly her political future. When she finally left her office at dawn, AOC was no longer the same politician who had arrived there the previous morning. She had learned that principled leadership sometimes meant standing completely alone, that conscience didn't always align with politics, and that the hardest votes were often the ones where every option involved betraying someone who trusted you. The vote itself was anticlimactic after the emotional journey that had led to it. AOC cast her ballot in favor of the Iron Dome funding, knowing that she was disappointing progressive allies while taking a position that felt morally necessary. The few seconds it took to press the voting button represented the culmination of the most difficult decision of her political career. The aftermath was swift and painful. Progressive organizations that had supported her campaigns issued statements expressing disappointment and betrayal. Social media exploded with criticism from former supporters who felt she had abandoned the principles that had brought her to Congress. Some donors demanded refunds of their contributions, while others simply announced they would never support her again. But there were also unexpected voices of support. Moderate Democrats who had previously viewed her with suspicion expressed respect for her willingness to make difficult decisions. Some Jewish American constituents who had been skeptical of her positions on Middle Eastern issues praised her vote as evidence of moral leadership. The personal cost was perhaps even greater than the political one. Relationships with squad members became strained as her closest allies struggled to understand how she could have made what they saw as a betrayal of progressive value. Friendships that had sustained her through the challenges of political life were suddenly complicated by policy disagreements that felt deeply personal. AOC found herself in the strange position of being criticized by progressives for being too moderate and by conservatives for being too liberal, a kind of political no man's land that few politicians willingly occupy. She had become a political orphan, no longer fitting neatly into the categories that had defined her career. In the weeks that followed, AOC would learn that political courage sometimes means accepting isolation, that principled decisions don't always feel good, and that leadership requires making choices that can't be easily defended in campaign material. She had discovered that governing was more complex than campaigning, that real decisions often involve choosing between competing values rather than choosing between good and evil. The Iron Dome vote would be remembered as the moment when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez transitioned from being a political activist to being a political leader, even if that transition came at the cost of some of the relationships and support that had made her rise possible. She had learned that standing alone was sometimes the price of standing up for what you believe is right. The lesson would shape the rest of her political career teaching her that genuine leadership often requires disappointing your supporters in service of larger principle, that conscience doesn't always align with politics, and that the loneliest moments in political life are often the ones that matter most. Click subscribe to see more stories of political courage and the personal cost of principled leadership. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.